Hi, I'm Maximilian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network and host of the podcast Working People, and this is the Art of Class War on Breaking Points. It's been nearly 2 weeks since the catastrophic derailment of a Norfolk Southern train in Northeast Ohio thrust the residents of East Palestine and the surrounding area into a non-stop waking nightmare. As we all know by now, and as Breaking Points has reported, the freight locomotive derailed on February 3rd, prompting an emergency response that involved the immediate evacuation of the town and the controlled release and burning of the toxic substance vinyl chloride, which was being carried in 5 of the train's 150 cars. While the controlled release of the vinyl chloride may have been necessary to prevent the cars containing the substance from exploding, the fallout appears to be something straight out of a horror movie, with the controlled burning spewing hydrogen chloride and phosgene into the air, a massive black death cloud covering the region, home-recorded videos of dead animals and fish throughout the area, and the Environmental Protection Agency reporting that more toxic chemicals on the derailed train have leaked out and been detected in the soil and surrounding waterways. It's going to take weeks, months, if not years, to fully appraise the damage of this train derailment on the population, on the rail workers, and on the first responders, and on the surrounding environment. But I suspect, and I think we are all right to suspect, that we are watching in real time the unfolding of a disaster that our generation and future generations will know by name. But while corporate spokespeople and many in the media try to paint this tragedy as some freak accident, we know better. We know better because we have been listening to railroad workers. For over a year now on Breaking Points, on the Real News Network, for my podcast, Working People, I have spoken in depth with railroad worker after railroad worker who have all been warning that Wall Street's takeover of the rail industry has been destroying the supply chain for the sake of record profits, driving record numbers of workers out of the industry and driving the workers who remain into the ground, cutting corners and cutting operating costs every chance they get, year after year, while stock buybacks, executive salaries, and shareholder dividends continue to skyrocket. Workers have been saying to anyone who will listen that all of these systemic issues, the same issues that rail companies, President Joe Biden, and Congress refused to address during the high-stakes contract negotiations that came to a head last year, have put all of us at risk of more accidents, more derailments, more disasters. In fact, we're going to play a clip for you now from an interview that I published on my podcast, Working People, back in July of last year, where I spoke with Jay, a longtime train dispatcher and a qualified conductor who was licensed to operate locomotives at just 19 years old. In this interview, Jay describes a hypothetical situation where a train carrying toxic substances derails near a populous town, and the parallels between what he described to me back in July and what we are watching unfold in East Palestine now are like X-Files level creepy. Take a listen.
Let me put together a scenario for everybody who's listening. Let's talk about these train tracks that run through your town. There's people that are running that train, people that have families just like you do, people that have kids, people that have wives and husbands, boyfriends, girlfriends, aunts and uncles, so on and so forth, And we're going to go to the local ball field in town. We're going to take our little league game out there. We got, parents everywhere. Everybody's cheering and clapping, yelling and hollering, go, 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 do it, run, the whole 9 yards. This is America, right? And here comes the train. All right. And you just expect it to pass through town like it normally does. You hear the clanging of the crossing bells, all of that. And then all of a sudden you hear this catastrophic metal twisting sound and just this horrible sound of wreckage that you've never heard before. And the train has derailed. We've piled up 50 or 60 cars, and unbeknownst to anybody, we've punched a hole in a chlorine car. We don't know it yet, but we've punched a hole in a chlorine car. So as a train dispatcher, I'm the guy in the office. I'm going to be one of your first responders if something like that happens. I'm the guy that's going to orchestrate the evacuation. I'm the guy that's going to do all of the hazmat stuff. I'm the one that's going to be the people that's going to mobilize the response to get you out of there. But there's one thing I need. I'm 700 miles away in an office in another state. I can't tell that train's derailed. All I know is PTC puts up a thing on my screen and says undesired emergency brake application. I'm like, all right, okay, well, that happens all the time. More often than not, there's not a derailment. But guess what? Today there is. Now, I don't know that. So the crew calls me and says, hey, dispatcher, we've got the train's in emergency, and we didn't like what we felt back there. We think something's wrong. I say, okay, put the conductor underground and send him for a walk. So he gets underground, and within a few minutes, he calls me on the radio and says, dispatcher, we got a hell of a mess back here, and I smell chlorine. And I'm like, okay, we're going to mobilize the response. Now, we got this little league game just a mile from the tracks at this field, and he tells me he smells chlorine. So I'm like, tell me on your wheel report, on the paperwork that you have in front of you, what is the last car that you can see that you think is upright and on the track? He gives me a number, and I start looking at the file on my end, and I say, oh, my God, we've got 10 chlorine cars in there, an anhydrous ammonia car, 4 loads of propane, and something else. Now, the railroads come in, and they say, we're going to put single-man crews in because, PTC is going to prevent that. Well, guess what? That derailment was a result of a broken rail, which PTC won't prevent, or a broken wheel that disintegrated because the railroads have abolished all of the mechanical inspectors that used to check train car wheels before they were permitted to leave the terminal. And we're going to frame this as what could happen. And people, if you're listening, listen to what I'm saying to you. This is your home. This is your town. These are your kids, your people, your friends, your family, people you care about. You have a vested interest in this, whether you realize it or not.
If you haven't already, I highly, highly recommend that you listen to the multiple full podcast episodes that I got to record with Jay on Working People, along with all the other interviews with rail workers that I recorded and published on my podcast, at The Real News, and here on Breaking Points. Because you will hear for yourself from people who actually know this industry inside and out, how and why the nightmare in East Palestine was so depressingly predictable. To say nothing of the absurd number of trains that are derailing around the country practically every week. I was regrettably unable to make it down to the Breaking Point studio this week to record this interview, but for our latest installment, let me start that again. I was regrettably unable to make it down to the Breaking Point studio this week, but for our latest installment of The Art of Class War, I recorded the following interview with Jay on Monday, February 13th, to get an insider's perspective on the Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, the fallout from this catastrophic derailment, and the larger Wall Street-led changes to the industry that have put all of us at risk and made catastrophes like this more and more likely. Well, Jay, thank you so much for joining us today on Breaking Points, man. I really, really appreciate it. Obviously, I wish that we were reconnecting under less horrifying circumstances, but, this is the situation that we're in, and I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely, Max. It's good to be back. And I'm honored to be of course, with you, and then to be on Breaking Points on top of it. I'm hopeful that we're able to put some perspective on this for some people and, give them the industry insider view of what we see versus what they see, or what the news media says versus what the boots on the ground are seeing every day, and we have quite a bit to talk about actually. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, so we got a lot to unpack, and I know normally you and I, when we record podcasts, we got 1, 2, even 3 hours to dig into that. So we're going to try to condense this for the great Breaking Points viewers and listeners as much as we can, squeeze as much as we can in the next 20 or 25 minutes. But as you said, like we recorded multiple podcasts over the course of the past year while all the drama was unfolding during the high stakes contract negotiations between the Class 1 freight rail carriers, i.e. the companies, and the 12 unions representing over 115,000 workers on the nation's freight rail system. And we talked a lot, about the sort of systemic issues that workers were really kind of taking issue with during the contract negotiations, the things that the rail companies have been doing to turn a once good job into a miserable experience, to increase, in fact, the likelihood of derailments and even catastrophic derailments like the ones that we're seeing right now. And so I wanted to kind of pick up on what you said, because I agree with you. Like, there has been, sustained coverage on this, including here on Breaking Points and great reporting partners like The Lever. But I do feel like there has been, overall a lack of worker voices like yours with all your accrued years of experience and expertise. And as you mentioned in the clip that I played during the intro, you're the guy in the dispatch office who's like responding to these calls that I know you hope you never get. But if and when a disaster, an emergency like this happens, you're the guy on the horn talking to the folks on the train, coordinating the emergency response. And I know that it's just a nightmare scenario. But I wanted to give people access to your perspective and your expertise, and ask if you could just sort of walk us through this horrific situation in East Palestine with the Norfolk Southern train derailment. Like, what are you seeing, like, when you review the facts that we know as of yet, about what led to this catastrophe, what it looks like, and what this kind of thing looks like on the ground for the people like yourself, like the first responders who are involved? And the last thing I'll say, just because I want to give a very clear disclaimer up front, I'm not going to ask Jay to, speculate on things that we don't currently know. There's a lot of information that's going to trickle out about this situation, what caused it, how bad the fallout is. There's going to be stuff we don't know for weeks, months, or even years right now. So I don't want to ask you to, I don't want to put you in an awkward position or talk about anything that's going to get you in trouble. But just with all of that knowledge and experience that you have, tell us what you're seeing when you look at the situation in East Palestine.
Well, one thing I think about, Max, when I look at a situation like this is, first and foremost, my thoughts and my heart goes out to the people that are involved. Sometimes it's easy to lose track of the fact that there's a train crew on that train. There's an engineer and a conductor, at least currently. We know in this particular case that it was a conductor trainee was also aboard. We know the townsfolk, that live there all their lives. I mean, some of these people, they've built their homes there, they've raised their families there. And for something like this to happen in your backyard is just terrifying. It would be, I can't even liken it to anything, because I hope and pray I never experience it. But for them, I feel badly that they've been through this. And as they return home, their homes are smelling like smoke. Nasty things. It's gross. And you're wondering how you're going to pay for that, who's going to address it. But when we say, what does this look like on the ground to an employee? I have to think to myself, what about the last year? So if we go back over the past year, we saw the union issues with the potential strike looming. We saw on April 26th and April 27th, we saw a STB hearing that was held where the Surface Transportation Board grilled railroad executives relentlessly about their cuts to the workforce, their reductions in staff by 30-some%. And we have to consider where those reductions have been made. They've been made in maintenance of way. They've been made to the car department. They've been made to critical staff that make sure that stuff like this doesn't happen. And keep in mind, the goal of any situation, any industry you're in, it doesn't matter what it is, you want to move the product, you want to move it safely, and you want to move it quickly. That's the case where you make the most money, right? So every business is a business to make money. But when I think about this, I think about this, the historic cuts that the railroads have been presently and previously making. And what's the goal there? It's to appease Wall Street. Wall Street are the ones pulling the strings. And if we look back over the last, say, roughly 10 years across the rail industry as a whole, you may actually remember Matt Burkhart gave testimony in front of the Surface Transportation Board on April 26th. He's a former manager, a high-level manager for BNSF, currently a yardmaster and general chairman for their local union. He talked about cars falling off of a bridge onto a well-known hiking trail. He talked about train lengths. They're too big. They don't fit anywhere. So when we think about this, over the past 10 years, let's rewind back to, say, 2010 to 2014, it was nearly unprecedented to hear of the number of mainline derailments that we're hearing of now. We had them. We had Castleton, North Dakota with the oil trains. There were a few of those. We had Lock-Megantic, which was catastrophic. I mean, you want to talk about hell coming to earth. It did in Lock-Megantic. And we have to consider, as we've continued down that path, we didn't see this kind of stuff happen very often. Where trains stayed on the tracks. Everything was fine. And then Hunter Harrison comes around. So 2018, and all of a sudden we see PSR. Well, PSR is all about cut, profits first. Shareholder value is, and I'm air quoting. You can't see me, but I'm air quoting.
Oh, I can hear the air quotes, right? It's like, and this is precision scheduled railroading. Like, this is the industry name, for all these kinds of changes that Jay is describing.
Yes, and you have to look at that and look at it very objectively. Be very careful about what you think of it. But let's be honest, Barnum and Bailey ran a better circus with fewer clowns. They should have left it up to them. But when we think about those STB hearings, we hear the railroads being scolded and scorned by the STB. And why were they scolded and scorned? Car inspectors serve as a preventative control. That's the position that they take. We used to have people all over the company that were railroad employees. They weren't contract workers. They were employed by the railroad directly. They were at every yard, and they would be on top of, underneath, in between, inside, to the left, to the right. I mean, they'd crawl all over these cars, and they would look for defects, bad bearings, safety appliances that were loose or broken. Sharp wheel flanges, broken wheels, all of these types of things which could cause a derailment. And back in the day, when workers felt valued by their corporations, that played a major role in discretionary effort. So we know that that's a critical factor in anything, is discretionary effort. Employers need it, they can't require it, and they have no way to measure it. So in recent years, from 2018 on, when this PSR thing came about, what did we do? We started attacking our workforce as an industry. The railroad companies started attacking them. We don't need you. We have record profits. We're going to cut this. We're going to cut that. Your job's going with it. Oh, by the way, Friday, you don't need to show up to work because you don't have a job anymore. And they've abolished this in the mechanical department, diesel shops, all of it. So let's think about this train that's racing along the track, right? There are wayside detectors out there. Every railroad has them. The spacing between them varies property to property, but a wayside detector is a detective control. So car inspectors preventative, i.e. you go to the dentist to get your teeth cleaned twice a year as a preventative measure to prevent cavities, gingivitis, etc., right? Well, that's the role of the car inspector, to prevent the accident from happening in the first place. He or she looks at the bearing and says, I don't like the way that bearing looks. I'm going to shop this car. I don't like the way that wheel looks. I think we've got an issue here. We're going to shop this car. We're going to send them to the shop for inspection, for further scrutiny to see if they're safe for the rails. And if they're not, we're going to go ahead and repair them. Now, when we look at the difference on detective controls. So we're going to kind of move over from what does it look like underground. We talked about the cuts. We talked about what the railroads are doing. We referred to the STB hearings. I would encourage you, if you've not seen it, guys, go watch them. There's some pretty heated testimony in there that'll really give you a lot of perspective. So I would encourage you to do that.
Well, and just to add one more footnote there. I remember screaming about this, I think on a previous Breaking Points segment, that Surface Transportation Board Martin Oberman said that the estimated that the rail carriers have spent, if I recall correctly, is around $40 billion more on stock buybacks than on rail maintenance in the past 10 years, right? So the money to maintain these tracks and these cars and to ensure all that kind of quality and safety, the quality assurance and safety measures that need to be put in place so that we don't see, horrific, catastrophic derailments like the one we're watching in East Palestine. Those are an afterthought compared to stuffing the pockets of Wall Street investors and rail executives.
Absolutely. I mean, look at what we've seen. Look at the derailments that didn't happen versus the ones that are happening, primarily in the last 4 years. They've been piled up on Horseshoe Curve multiple times. That's a national landmark. It's recorded 24/7 and streamed to the internet by virtual rail fan. You can watch trains all day long. And we watched them pile them up. It's like, oops, that's a bad thing. We don't like that, right? So the podcast that we did back in July was eerily similar. I mean, I laid out an event very similar to this. In this particular case, it was a single man crew, and it was chlorine. Now, vinyl chloride, which is what we know was spilled in this accident, if it happens to ignite, is probably the best case scenario, the best case of the worst cases. And why do I say that? One, you can't see it if it doesn't burn. So you're going to have a hard time detecting if there's anything wrong until you're exposed. And that's where the danger really comes in, because you have limited time to be exposed to it before it does serious damage. So looking at the situation, the train derailed just outside of town. Thankfully, had it been in town and burst into flames like that, there would have likely been collateral damage in the form of other homes and buildings being set ablaze by the radiant heat from that fire. Then we have to look at the fact, okay, it was close enough to a populated area that the police are going to notify the railroad right away. There's infrastructure to get there. So fire departments from 3 states responded, and that's all well and good. Now we get out there and it's 4 degrees and the pump trucks freeze up. Uh-oh. We have an even bigger problem. So we literally had a perfect disaster here. Thankfully, there was no loss of life. But if we move on to the mainstream media question, the narrative is that there's a technical failure. And why were railroaders like myself and others predicting this? Well, the technical failure, the NTSB made note of some video that they had received of what they believe was this particular train passing through New Watertown, Ohio, about 13 miles before the derailment, is my understanding, with an obvious situation developing. There's fire surrounding what appears to be the bearing in the car. It's not the best video quality, and it's dark, so you can't really zoom in and see that. But based on my experience, it looks to me like we have a bearing issue that's going on there. So a rail car bearing is a roller bearing now. It's no longer a pile of greasy rag stuffed in the end of an axle. It's actually a roller bearing, and that's a sealed bearing with grease and stuff in it. And periodically they go bad. And when they do, this is where your wayside detectors come in. So you fire all your car inspectors, you hire contractors in, right? And we have to think about knowledge versus wisdom. So you get rid of all your experienced people. You're losing 20-year men and women walking out the door saying, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And you bring these new people in. Well, knowledge versus wisdom is what? Knowledge means you possess knowledge about a subject. Wisdom means you have perspective on a subject. So the 20-year person walking out the door takes the perspective with them. The new person coming in, sure, they're air quote qualified, end air quote, but they lack the perspective. So when you think about what the detector does, you bring these new car inspectors in, they look at something, I don't think anything's wrong with it. Send it out on the railroad. The train's whizzing by the detector, and it says, okay, all the bearings on the train primarily are within, say, 20 degrees of ambient air temperature, whatever that is. And then, boom, one bearing goes over top, and that one's 103 degrees above. That's going to initiate a flag. At least it should. And what are we going to do with that information? We take this information then, which is now intelligible information, and we present it to a human being. All right. What does the human being do? We now look at this from a intelligent perspective, and we say, what do we think we have here? Is this something that requires action? In this case, the answer would be yes. All the other bearings are within 40 degrees of each other. We have one here that's popping a flag on us for 103 degrees above ambient. So we're going to stop the train and inspect it. Well, that's all well and good, but we've cut everybody. So all of these detectors all across the railroad could potentially be sending data in to one person, and you have to wait for one person to read that. Well, if the train's traveling at 60 miles an hour, they're doing a mile a minute. If it takes them 18 minutes to get to that particular message, that train's going 18 miles. So when you think about detective controls, let's think of some examples in history where detective controls were used. So let's go back to 1912. We're going to think about the Titanic. Who doesn't know the story of the Titanic, right? Like, there's nobody that doesn't know that. So Captain Smith was interviewed prior to the maiden voyage of the Titanic, and he was asked, what he thought about an unsinkable ship and why they didn't have enough lifeboats for everybody. And his answer was something to the effect of, maritime technology had advanced to the point where they didn't see any accident being possible that could result in a ship foundering prior to the arrival of another ship to take everybody off. So we don't have radar at the time. We don't have 24-hour manned radios at the time. All of the stuff we know today, much of it came as a result of what happened there. So we have two men in a crow's nest, way above the deck, looking out in front of the ship, right? That's their job. They are now serving as a detective control. So here goes the Titanic careening across the ocean. All right, we're at almost full steam. The engines are down there pounding away. The furnaces are blazing hot, black smoke pouring out of the stacks. And Titanic sails farther south than she normally would. Well, unfortunately, in 1912, we have an ocean that's as still as a mill pond, as they say. We have an unusually cold Labrador current, which has penetrated unusually far south for that time of year. And we literally run into a perfect storm, kind of like what happened in East Palestine, kind of like what happened in Graniteville and Paulsboro, New Jersey. The ship sails into this cold water, and what does it do? The cold water chills the atmosphere for tens, if not several hundred feet above the surface of the ocean. So in so doing, we create a temperature inversion. The temperature inversion pulls the horizon up and cloaks the iceberg in blackness. There's no stars, there's nothing. You can't see it. There's no silhouette anymore because your horizon is curled up due to that temperature. So the crow's nest, these two guys are up there looking. They can't see anything. Something that should be visible for 10 miles is now not visible except for a few thousand yards potentially. And out of the blackness, as the ship steams forward, comes this black mass of ice. They're horrified. They ring the bell 3 times. They pick up the phone and they call the bridge. What are they doing? They have no steering wheel and they have no engine telegraph. They are going to provide intelligible information to the crew on the bridge, which will then be acted upon. We know how the story ended. They tried to turn, they tried to reverse. It didn't happen. Titanic hit the iceberg and 1,500 plus lives were lost. So we think about detective controls across the railroad. We think about the crow's nest example I just gave. If you look at what you do in this respect, it takes a human to relay information, which goes to another human that then ideally results in an action that hopefully prevents what we saw. So it's been said by the NTSB that moments before the derailment, another wayside detector alerted for a critical alarm. So again, our detective control says, hey, I see something critical, stop the train. And it sounds like they didn't have time. This will all come out in the investigation. It'll be weeks for the preliminary report and months for the final report. Excuse me. But when you think about it, communication is both the root cause and the solution to most of our problems. So if you look at the industry as a whole, as we reduce people and we reduce interactions of people who possess wisdom versus knowledge, what do we do to ourselves? We're breaking down the preventative control measures. And we're trying to rely on detective control measures to prevent what should have otherwise been found by a human being. What does that say? I mean, where are we as a country when we're allowing corporations to dictate to the regulatory bodies what they will and won't do? The Surface Transport Board. What happens?
Well, apparently this is what fucking happens, right? So pardon my French, everybody, but like, you guys know, like, that my colleague Mel Buer at The Real News, like, we've been covering the crisis, the long brewing crisis on the nation's railroad system for over a year now, right? And I've been talking endlessly and publishing, hours and hours of interviews with rail workers like Jay, like Matt Parker, like Marilee Taylor, like Michael Paul Lindsay, right? I mean, like, all these folks with so much knowledge that I am begging you to listen to, because we're going to keep ending up in situations like this, which is what workers like Jay and others have been telling me, right? Because I think like that's the part where I'm really losing my mind here, man. And I know I've got to let you go in a second. So just to kind of like round this thought out, because I think there's a real there's a really sad metaphor here in the way that we're talking about East Palestine and the Norfolk Southern derailment that we're watching unfold. And the larger kind of crisis that we were reporting on all last year while the contract negotiations between the rail carriers and the unions representing rail workers were unfolding. Biden's presidential emergency board got involved, yada, yada, yada. When I watch the mainstream media coverage of the derailment in East Palestine and the fallout of it, like you said, they tend to focus on like a technical failure. And of course, there are more facets to that story that we will know in the weeks and months that come after this. I know that Breaking Points and The Lever have both reported that, that they have linked this back to, like, say, the fact that Norfolk Southern and other rail carriers successfully lobbied the Trump government and successfully pushed the Obama government to back down. But they essentially got safety regulations wiped off the ledger when the government was pushing for these companies to implement electric braking systems. The current speculation is that if those braking systems were installed, maybe this derailment wouldn't have been as bad as it was. Again, we don't necessarily know that right now, but it is an important part of this story. But what I'm pointing to, what Jay just really described, right, is that when we talk about the derailment in East Palestine right now, we talk about the fact that this train carrying these incredibly hazardous substances, mainly vinyl chloride, that, as you mentioned, is very flammable. They punctured, the emergency response team punctured those rail cars. They emptied that toxic or hazardous substance into a trench. They lit it on fire, hence the massive fireball that we've all seen videos and pictures of. Hence, all the crap spewing into the air from that, yada, yada, yada. And obviously that's a horrifying image. And so when folks see that, like myself, they think, well, that's not good. But the governor, in Ohio, the mainstream media, the rail carriers themselves are saying, yeah, but this was necessary. This was the best of the worst scenarios, because if we didn't release that, vinyl chloride, if we didn't burn it off, then those cars could have exploded. That would have been a worse option. There would have been shrapnel going all over the place. I get that, burning the vinyl chloride on a train that had already derailed is the right thing to do in that situation. But we're talking about it the same way that the media was talking about Biden and Congress, just forcing rail workers like yourself to accept a contract near the end of last year. Instead of allowing workers to go on strike, instead of allowing the negotiations to continue. And so the media was celebrating this as we averted a catastrophe, right? If a rail strike or a lockout happened, Christmas would have been canceled. It would have been total chaos, would have cost the U.S. economy $2 billion a day, yada, yada, yada. So we talk about and we pat ourselves on the back for averting the immediate catastrophe. And then we do nothing to address the underlying issues that are making catastrophes like this more likely. And that, in fact, they are happening all around us. Like Norfolk Southern itself, this particular company had like 2 train derailments like the very week that Biden and Congress forced workers to accept a contract back in November, early December, right? I mean, like these derailments, as Jay described in that first podcast to me, like they're happening all over the place. Like, thankfully, we haven't had one that's this catastrophic, like of late, but here it is. And yet, you know, what are these companies going to learn? What are they going to do? What incentive is there for them to do anything different after Scab Joe Biden and Congress just gave them everything that they want and crushed workers back into subservience? What did we see? We saw these companies giving themselves more stock buybacks, paying out more shareholder dividends, making more profits. You know, like they're going to, like, again, I feel like I'm losing my mind here, Jay.
Like, Max, you're 100% right. It's maddening. It's sickening. If you work in the industry, one thing I think about when I work with all of my men and women in the field is my success is a direct result of the relationships that I have with these people. Whether they're in maintenance of way, whether they're training engine crews, they trust me. There's a degree of emotional intelligence there that I possess when I speak to those guys. They know when I'm happy, when I'm upset. I mean, I wear my emotions on my sleeve. They can sense it. They can feel it. It's palpable, you know? So why have other railroaders been talking about this? Well, we're in it every day. When I walk in the office, I don't expect this to happen. I don't want it to happen. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want the possibility of a loss of life. If you see that 911 tone come across the radio for a train dispatcher, there's usually 2 things that happen. One, we hit a vehicle at a crossing that has the potential to involve casualties or fatalities, or 2, we have a derailment. It's generally the only 2 times I'm going to get a 911 tone or maybe a medical emergency, which could happen. So we've been talking about this stuff in the industry for quite some time, and people are looking at these cars saying they don't belong out here. How did this damn thing get here? Look at this. Like it doesn't. The wheels are in bad shape. The brake pads are worn down. Brake shoes are worn down. Beyond specification. We've got torn metal and broken safety appliances on these super trains. You have to consider the forces in the train. Think about the power a locomotive can put down. You're damn near 200,000 pounds of tractive effort. And your train is 15,000 feet long. I mean, you're in one town with the engines and your ass end is in the next town over. And here you go, 50 some miles an hour, and you're trying to keep track of all of this. You've got these slow orders and these speed restrictions, and you've got the PTC screen screaming in your face and Trip Optimizer screaming in your face. And then you have a new conductor that has no idea what's going on because the training is so bad. I mean, all of this is culminating to literally create the perfect storm. And you have to consider other chemicals. Not every chemical that's dangerous is in liquid form. There's chemicals out there, for example, that are hauled in covered hoppers. And this is where the conductor is so critical because he or she possesses that paperwork to give to first responders. There's certain chemicals, for example, like sodium hydride, which reacts explosively with water. There's potassium metals, which forms hydrogen gas. Well, hydrogen gas is explosive. So if you have a situation where a rail accident happens and you end up with a fire, and you have cars close by that contain some of these chemicals like potassium hydride, which also releases hydrogen gas, you could end up with a real situation if you take fire hoses out there and start spraying. I mean, now you get a really big fire. Not only do you have the existing fire, but you spray this powdered substance with water and kaboom, it goes up. And you got a really big problem. So as these cuts continue to happen, as record profits continue to be the focus, what do you do to people's mentality when you tell them they're no longer valued? We don't need you. Technology is going to replace you. We don't need your job. You're not important. Nothing you do is of value. You don't contribute to company profits, blah, blah, blah. What does that do to somebody? At what point? I mean, that's like a mind warp. You don't have any incentive at that point to engage in applying discretionary effort. And that goes right back to what I said in the beginning. The discretionary effort that an employee exerts into the workplace is required by the company for its success. They can't make you do it, and they can't measure it. But if you're going down there and you feel valued, you're going to be a lot more diligent. You're going to look at things with a much more, focused eye, and you're going to say, I don't like that. I'm going to do something about it. But if you don't feel valued, you're just, okay, good enough. Down she goes, sign off the paperwork. Go, yep, okay, it'll make it, blah, blah. And this is human nature. This is psychology 101. I mean, if we talk to a psychologist and we were to dive into that, they would tell you how the human psyche works when people tell you this stuff. This is why I say management possesses a total lack of emotional intelligence. You can't tell people that they're not valued, abolish their jobs, and then ask them to help you. Because you know what you're going to get. It's a big old fat middle finger. Yeah. And unfortunately, look where we are. This is the saddest part about the whole thing. I hope it changes. The STB hasn't done anything. The FRA hasn't done anything. Now, we haven't heard about the two-man crew ruling yet. So maybe this will change their opinion a little bit. Keep in mind, most of the time, the only time you're going to hear from this, it's number one, it's political posturing. So it looks good and it feels good. It's all touchy-feely. Okay, they're doing something because we saw them talk. But are you actually going to do something? Are you going to put your money where your mouth is and say, that's enough? That's enough. This jeopardy is going to stop. You make plenty of damn money. That we're reeling you in right here. We're going to slap some regulations on you, and you're going to stop this madness. You're going to start running more reasonable trains. You're going to inspect them properly. I mean, I had a contract car inspector come out and put a portable derail in the middle of a mainline interlocking, and I didn't know it was there. It could have derailed a train purposefully, because that's the job of that device. But you can't do that. You cannot come out and put that kind of stuff there. And this is where you go back to knowledge versus wisdom. I know what the derail's for, but I don't know where to put it. So, God bless. I digress.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I could talk to you for hours, man. And I hope that, in some, that we've been able to enlighten folks a little bit more on how we got to this situation in East Palestine, Ohio, right? Again, there's going to be a lot about this derailment. There's going to be a lot about the emergency response, the evacuation. There's going to be a lot about the residual health and environmental effects of that response that sadly we're not going to know for, a while. But obviously we have to stay vigilant. We have to keep paying attention to this. We have to read those reports, from the, Surface Transportation Board, from the National Transportation Safety Board, we need to follow up on this and not just let companies like Norfolk Southern, say, oh, our bad, sorry, won't happen again, while they literally do nothing to address the root causes that are putting all of us at hazard, right? And that's what I just really want to drive home for folks. I know this segment went long. I hope it was useful for you, but I really hope that what Jay said resonates, because we need to understand that all the stuff we were screaming about last year, all the stuff that Biden's Presidential Emergency Board and that the forced contract that Congress made workers accept at the end of last year, none of that addressed these core issues that Jay and other railroad workers have been talking about. Does not address the fact that the rail companies have been slashing their workforce year after year after year, piling more work onto fewer workers, making the trains longer and heavier, more unwieldy, while reducing the crew sizes down to 2, and they want to get it down to 1 person on those trains. Imagine how much worse this catastrophe in East Palestine would have been if the railroads had their way and had just 1 person on that train when it derailed, right? And you can't just have a situation like that. You can't just have a situation where Wall Street is literally sucking all of the resources out of this industry instead of investing in its workforce, instead of investing in preventative safety measures, instead of investing in track maintenance, let alone, track electrification and other things like that. You can't just keep going in this direction where the only thing we are doing is destroying the nation, one of the nation's vital supply chains for the sake of Wall Street profits, and driving workers into the ground, making them feel unappreciated, treating them like crap, causing them to flee the industry in record numbers. you are going to end up with more situations like this, right? So we have to do something. We have to listen to workers like Jay. I beg of you guys. I know I'm frustrated because I spent all year doing this. Now imagine if you've been working on the rails for decades like Jay has, how frustrating this must be. So please stay vigilant. Listen to workers, lift up voices of workers like Jay. And thank you so much for watching this segment with Breaking Points. And Jay, longtime trained dispatcher, trained as a locomotive engineer. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Max. It's great to be with you, and thank you everybody for listening. I hope this really sinks in and hits home with you. You know, get out there, get behind this cause, and do something. It's your life, it's your town, it's your home. You decide.
Thank you for watching this segment with Breaking Points, and be sure to subscribe to my news outlet, The Real News, with links in the show description. See you soon for the next edition of The Art of Class War. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Solidarity forever.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.